times that are holy, and as we said, it's all holy, it's all important, and that's why it's so hard sometimes to find that balance. You know, sometimes it's just.
A note to residents, all citizens are welcome to attend public board and committee meetings in person. Additionally, in an effort to maximize citizen engagement opportunities, citizens will be able to continue to participate remotely via phone or Zoom. The meetings will also be live streamed by Franklin TV and shown on Comcast Channel 11 and Verizon Channel 29. The call-in number is 929-205-6099, and the meeting ID is 881-4928-6760, and then you must hit the pound sign. Okay, I think the first thing I'd like to do tonight is just introduce the members of the Joint Budget Subcommittee. And from the Finance Committee, Terrell Hansen, Natalie Riley, George Conley, Kobe Frangillo from the Town Council, Melanie Hamblin from the Town Council, Brian Chandler from the Town Council. I skipped myself.
I know.
Dave McNeil from the from the School Committee, and Dave Callahan from the School Committee. Megan Whitmore will be a few minutes late from the School Committee, and Nicole Cobicero from the Finance Committee was unable to attend tonight, but she is a member of this committee.
Okay.
First off, I guess I'd ask the committee members if everybody understood the charge of the committee, which was basically printed out on the agenda, and if anybody has any questions on the charge to the committee. Perfect. Okay, as the public portion of the budget process begins tonight, I think tonight's meeting should focus on educating everyone on the architecture of the town budget process, revenue, projections, and expenditures. I'm well aware everyone has many opinions, questions, and priorities, but I think it's important to take this one step at a time and not put the cart before the horse. Let's allow the town administrator and superintendent to discuss the budget and make sure when we leave here this evening, we are all on the same page of what goes into the budget, the cost drivers, and the status of the process. I do think we should meet again, and my plan is to meet again in April, and then seasonally get together as the Joint Budget Subcommittee as things come on, just to kind of keep the communication lines open between the three important boards, being the School Committee, Finance Committee, and the Town Council, so that we're all functioning together as one team, because we are one town. So my plan would be a meeting in April, and then we'll see where we go from there. And I think it's important for everyone in the listening audience to know that the Finance Committee will do deep dives into the budget during their hearings, which May 9th through the 12th, right?
Yep.
Okay. With that being said, Jamie, you want to lead off?
You got it, Mr. Chair. So Alicia, as expected, is throwing up the revenue and control sheet. Thanks, Alicia. So just for the folks at home, I'm going to do my very, very best to try to keep this at a very high level so that everybody kind of understands, I think, the revenue picture going into FY23, as well as some of the assumptions. I want to make sure everybody really understands this is just a model. Thus far, during January is when all the departmental budgets were requested to be into the finance director. Normally, we have a deadline of New Year's Eve, but due to Omicron and the pandemic and a lot of other things, we gave everybody a couple more weeks. The finance staff have met with every single town department. Some of the assessments from some of the outside districts like the MEC and Charles River, Animal Control, some of the others that we'll talk about, some of those assessments have come in and it's normal. Some of them have not come in yet. Some of them will be adjusted. And as I go through, I'm going to try to highlight as easily as possible for people to understand where the numbers are coming from and where we're at. This is a model. It will continue to evolve throughout the rest of the season. But also, even after the council approves a budget in May, the budget continues to evolve. It is a 24/7, 365 exercise. And people really do need to understand that there is no real ever deadline to the town budget. It just keeps rolling. And much of the procedures and processes that are discussed probably this evening and moving throughout the FinCom hearings, the state fiscal process and the local process are really ingrained mostly in state law. So it's not like there's a lot of options that we can just kind of move things around in different dates and timelines. So if folks go to the town website on the town calendar and look under tonight's date, you'll see tonight's agenda, and you will have a copy of the preliminary budget model, which Alicia has put on the screen, and I think all of you here tonight have copies in front of you. I'm going to start with the revenue picture. Right at the top is the main revenue source for the town of Franklin. It's under the category tax levy. Prior year limits, we have FY 21, 22, and proposed 23. There's no magic here, folks. You just take last year's number and times it by 2.5. That's as simple as you get. So for those that are looking forward to what the tax levy might be in 24, 25, 26, 27, just keep doing 2.5, 2.5, 2.5. And what we have here is an estimation of $3.2 million in additional tax levy revenue for the town of Franklin in FY 23. The second line item underneath is called new growth. Many people have probably heard that term before. And you'll notice that in the final in FY 22 was 1.1 million, which was approved by the council on a reduction, I might add, last November in 2021. You'll also notice in FY 21 there was 1.6 million. In the budget documents online, you could go back the previous 3 or 4 years, and you will see record-breaking new growth numbers. I want the public and everybody here to understand we didn't spend all of that. Okay, so each year of those record-breaking 4 years saw new growth be allocated towards critical policy objectives. Number one, in FY19, the Franklin School Department got a bump of estimated roughly, just round numbers, of an additional $1 million in their base to a $3 million increase in 1 year from another because of the new growth in town was very aplenty. Then the next 3 years, the council has authorized 2 increments of $1 million into the budget stabilization fund, as well as a little over $1 million into the open space stabilization fund. The open space was done prior to the CPA passing, but nonetheless, I think as everybody knows, land is extraordinarily expensive, and you have to be ready when something comes available. So there is $2.5 million still left in that account. I do think it's important for the public to understand that we're not just stashing money away for fun or to keep money away from other people or some of the other rumors I hear from folks. That has a very big, and we heard this at the meeting, at the OPEB presentation at the last council meeting, the Budget Stabilization Fund, now at $2 million, bond rating agencies look very favorable upon that, and I can definitely speak for the finance director and myself. We are really, really determined to get a AAA bond rating someday. We're at the next level below that, and that's a big, big goal, which really has a huge impact on interest rates, which really does save, as you'll find out later, in the debt and interest line items, saves a lot of money, which also saves a lot of capacity in the operating budget for other services. So you'll notice in FY23, we have a placeholder right now. A lot of the columns I've put in like a yellow mustard color. We're estimating right now about 900,000 in new growth. We're still working with the Board of Assessors to refine that number. This is a great example of something that might go up or down a little bit. And the 900,000 reflects the fact that there are fewer applications for development at the planning board. There is less, there's obviously more risk in the marketplace, therefore there's less investment. And most notably, homeowners have kind of completed a lot of house projects, which during the pandemic continued on. But really, new growth comes from evaluations and assessments of personal property in town where you've redone your kitchen, you've built a new deck, you've done a major roof repair. That all gets captured in unanticipated revenue in the levy. That gets captured throughout the year in new growth. I'm just using those as examples and trying to keep it short. So ultimately, you've got a net of $2.99 million in new revenue. So just about $3 million in tax levy growth over last fiscal year. The next category is debt exclusions. The debt exclusions are votes by the taxpayers. As you can see here, it's all schools. And so that was the high school, that was Horace Mann, and so forth. You'll notice throughout, even in those columns, you'll notice parentheses, which means those payments are going down. But they're slightly off budget because debt exclusions are voted by the taxpayers over a series of years, decades really. And ultimately, when those bond schedules come down, you see those numbers kind of tick down a little bit. And ultimately, when a project is complete and when the bonds are fully paid off, that tax is then reduced off the tax rate. That is the substantial difference between a debt exclusion and other revenue-raising ideas. So that's kind of separate, but it all does, under state law, it's a part of your tax levy because the tax levy was increased for a project, and it will sunset at the appropriate time in the future. You can tell by the parentheses there that those are going to start to sunset over the next 10 years. Third category, state revenue. You can see over in the column in the Chapter 70, charter school reimbursements, UGA, and other net offsets. We use in this budget model the Governor's House 2 budget model. We will not ever change these numbers mid-budget cycle based on the House numbers in April, nor the Senate numbers in May, because ultimately the state budget, as many of you know, really doesn't get complete until July or August when we get the final numbers. And then just to illustrate, we come back to the council, which most towns do at special town meeting, by the way. They come back in the fall in November, and they reallocate the budget based off what the final local aid numbers are put forth by the governor, or excuse me, the legislature. So you see there about a net of about 950,000, but I caution people not to get greedy for a moment. That is not actually a net. We'll get to the deductions in a moment. Other revenue sources. Number 4, local receipts and host community agreements. So local receipts are probably one of the other most substantial local revenue sources for the town, for any community. And you'll notice over the last couple of years, surprisingly, they've stayed fairly stable. We've decided to, by policy, to put both the hotel tax as well as the cannabis excise tax into local receipts. Because with the decline in applications at the ZBA or some of the other boards, building permits, license transactions, other things may level off or decline. And so we know there's a lot of pressure on the operating budget and less the capital budget. So at least for the time being moving forward, having those two revenue sources does give us hopefully a little bit of a bump over last year. And so that 300,000 number in there reflects reasonably our accurate assessment based on what we think the hotel industry will see as a bump up now that the pandemic is hopefully waning, as well as a cannabis excise tax, which we've never had before and we don't know exactly how to predict. But over the next couple of years, once the stores are open and the business lines flat out, we'll kind of have a better idea of exactly how much we count on every year. Prior to the pandemic, we could count on about $500,000 to $600,000 a year in hotel taxes. But that was at 85% occupancy. I've met with the hotels in January with Lily, and they're now at about 40 to 45%. So they still really have not climbed out, but that's a 6% hotel tax. and we are a spillover hotel community. We basically have more affordable hotels for Gillette, Great Woods, Marlboro, and some of the other areas that have major events, as well as Dean College, having restrictions really did hurt the hotel industry here quite a bit, in addition to the business sector of less conferences and things like that. So we are working with them to try to strategize on some ways to continue to get that occupancy, not only for their own business solvency back up, but also for our own revenue source. Just to illustrate for folks that are here, most of the local receipts are excise tax. So you're looking at motor vehicle excise, meals tax, hotel tax, cannabis excise tax, and a lot of other small categories of penalties and interest, fees, which are really building fees, licensing fees, alcohol licensing fees, and a variety of other smaller revenue sources that make up that number. Each year, the finance director and I, and the treasurer collector, we go through each line item of revenues. We try to do the best judgment we can with the departments, as well as state mass benchmarks and some other sources on where the economy's going. We don't just kind of rubber stamp it through every year. We really do look at it and say, well, where are auto sales? You know, it's been a strange year for auto sales. Will that continue? Right now, everybody got the excise tax bill in the mail, so everybody's pretty familiar with it. But half of that account right there is motor vehicle excise, approximately, just to give some illustrative purposes of where those revenues come from. And then other available funds. These are indirect expenditures that come in from other sources like OPEB, other subsequent votes into that line item there. And we don't see a tremendous amount of change there every year. There could be stabilization, one-time sources, a variety of other revenues that come in. It's pretty much flatlined through most of the years and isn't a substantial revenue. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, the assessments and other votes down at the bottom, that's essentially your deductions. So if you look, for example, just to illustrate, the charter school assessment down there is $740,000. So when you get reimbursements up top at $729, you're basically coming out even. So from a state aid perspective, you're flatlined. And if you look down at the bottom, you'll notice in the right-hand column a number of 272,318. You'll notice right above it, parentheses, 600,000. We're moving the host community agreement money into a different line item. I don't want to go into a deep dive on this. I'll just let you know it's a very fluctuating market. The regulations change at the Cannabis Commission. This is really a 5 to 10 year maturation of a new market, of a new product in Massachusetts. And the state agencies are doing the best they can to keep up with the regulatory issues, but they've never really promulgated guidance on where to put this in our budget as a revenue source. So we've been kind of working throughout this. The reason why I mention this is you'll see the negative 600,000, but up above you'll see the 600,000 is going in local receipts. So really that 272 of deductions is really 872 ultimately, because you're really taking the money out of those other accounts in the charter schools on the assessments, and so it kind of all evens out in the end. People may ask, you know, what state assessments, county assessments? These are oddities like mosquito control. They're basically items in state law and in the state budget that we are obligated to pay for through a service, you know, through the county assessment and some other odds and ends. But ultimately, that section right there is again dictated to us by the governor's or the legislature's, you know, budgetary proposals. So I did that in about 15 minutes. So then you get down to the bottom number, 3.264829. That number will come into, you'll get it when we go to the budget in a minute, but that's ultimately what your deficit number is right now, based on those revenue assumptions and how they relate to the wish list of expenditures by our town departments, or what you'll find out tonight is really our fixed costs, okay? But we'll get into that in a minute, but I'm just highlighting that for you now. Mr. Chairman, I think it's probably a good time for me to take a break and answer any questions on revenue assumptions.
Perfect. Thanks, Jamie. Any questions of Jamie on the revenue side of things?
I just have a quick one on the new growth, because I know that's a big assumption. It's not a huge item, but how are we trending on the 1.1 for fiscal year '22?
Pretty good.
So it's pretty much on, okay.
Pretty good. I would note, your question kind of, Natalie, so people may say, how do we determine that number, right? By our policy, we use a 10-year average of new growth, okay? So if you do the last 10 years, the 10-year average is actually 1.22 million. So people may say to me, well, why are you going to downgrade it to 900,000 if the 10-year average, why are you going to go against town policy? Because the new growth number in FY22, we did it a 10-year average, and we weren't going to come anywhere close to it. In fact, it was probably a 10 to 15% reduction ultimately in what we budgeted a year and a half ago versus reality. So we're ballparking at this point that until we have more confidence from the assessors that next year we can hit that 900,000 number, the assessors may also come to me in a few weeks and say, we think we will hit the 10-year average. Well, then by the time the budget's finalized, I will have adjusted that number to reflect the 1.22. But based on the fact that we're at 1.1 and we're going to get in just over the goal line, we're trying to be a little additionally conservative, partially for expectation management, just to make sure that people really know that this is a tight year.
Makes sense, thanks.
All set, Natalie?
Yes, thank you.
Anyone else? Mr. Chandler?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, to the town administrator. So I know we're about to put another $1 million into the stabilization fund. And you said there's already $1 million in there, so that'll equal, this is for more of the people at home right
Yeah.
now. So we'll have $2 million in the stabilization fund.
That's correct.
Available.
That's what we call the rainy day. That's what we
Rainy
would
day
call our local rainy day fund.
Right,
Yeah.
so I want some people to know there is some money
That's right.
here. It's not, we're at zero.
Nope.
Okay, I just
We
wanted to-
were, but I think you were going to say, we were at zero
We
3 years
We're
ago.
at zero.
Correct, well, that's, but, when people talk about Franklin always finds money, all of a sudden now I know we have 2 million in there. So I just want people to understand that it's not at zero. All right, thank you.
All set?
Yes.
Anyone else?
Yep.
Terrell?
So I just wanted to make sure I understood. So when I was just looking at you said that cannabis is taken out in the deduction down below, that's reflected in the other revenues and the local receipts. So just adjusting for that 600,000, the local receipts would actually be lower using the same stuff you did last year, right? If the same items. So I'm just wondering kind of what drives that. Is that all the hotel industry? But I thought that's been weak for a little bit. So I'm just not sure if you're just being conservative there or what drives that.
It's a great question. So I'm going to take this opportunity to do just a little bit more of a deep dive. So there's 2 cannabis revenue sources. There's one, the host community agreement line item, which we are predicting to be less than last year, from 600,000 to 425. And that's because under state law, you can have a maximum impact agreement of up to 3% of gross sales. And both the town as well as the stores that were being permitted, when they originally got permitted several years ago, or 3 years ago, they were anticipating being open earlier. So we all thought that they would actually sell more than what they actually have. So that number actually has to go down. That number actually may go down a little bit more. But I want to caution people, that is not a free rein revenue source. By state statute, we have to use those revenues, and you'll see it in the police budget, by the way, just to illustrate. You have to use those resources relative to impacts of those facilities being open. I would also make a note, just to really complicate it one more level, the legislature put out a omnibus bill in January to fix a bunch of technical things that are incorrect in the cannabis law. One of those provisions in that law mandates that every town must go back to every cannabis manufacturer, retailer, wholesaler, and renegotiate every agreement to conform to a new set of rules that they are about to pass in law. I don't know when that law is going to pass, but judging by the fact that the committee voted it unanimously out, and it does genuinely solve 5 or 6 major policy problems, my best guess tells me that it's going to pass at some point by the end of July before they go on recess for the legislative session. So those numbers are likely to stay where they are, and they might just get adjusted in the fall. The second revenue source is they call it an excise tax, Tyrell. It's really a local sales tax, just like meals and hotel. So when you go in, you buy $100, whatever, you get a 3% sales tax on it. It's actually 20% for the state, but we get 3% locally. That revenue source for the 3% is in there. So we estimate the $300,000 right now is going to reflect both what we believe will be sold over a 12-month period from a sales tax perspective from cannabis, but also accommodate a higher percentage of hotel rentals over the summer and the fall, obviously pending how the economy rebounds. But we do believe, as the hotels believe, that those numbers will tick up. And so we're doing our best guess estimates at those. I hope that answers most of the questions. Yep.
Set. Anyone else? Continue, Jamie.
Thank you. So next page, Alicia, if you could throw it down one slide. So this is the voting document for those watching at home on your screen. Again, all this is on the website. Go to town budget. You can look through the last 7 years of town budgets, and you'll see this. This is what is required by to be approved by both the Finance Committee and the Town Council as part of the budget. So we're doing high-level analysis here. As you can see, the FY22 in the right column, FY22 to FY23, increase, decrease. Most of these numbers are pretty small and de minimis. I'm going to focus tonight to try to be efficient on the areas where there's yellow. So Alicia, if you could just scroll down just a little more to HR. HR and IT are two rare departments that would be in this category, but you can see there are some substantial bumps. In the proposal right now, there is a benefits manager, a full-time benefits manager that is budgeted for in the HR line item. This would be a benefits manager that, for now, we've just, for illustrative purposes, I put it in the budget under the town municipal side at the full salary amount. This would benefit both the town and the schools in having one individual take a lot off our shoulders in terms of helping with health insurance, benefits, open enrollment, benefits fairs, and a variety of other things where we haven't really formulated a full job description. We're still working on that, but that is in there. And then also in IT, there's a large bump that reflects some small license agreement increases, which we usually budget 5 to 7% is Tim's estimate, usually on an annual license agreement for all of our town licenses, Munis, Finance Software, Viewpoint. But also we added in there enough money for the personnel filing system, electronic personnel filing system, onboarding, online applications, and et cetera. So again, Human Resources and Technology are still working to refine those numbers, but these are the estimates that we have right now. I'm going to skip to the next page, 192. Whoop. 192, Alicia, right up top, just a little. Public property and buildings. I should use the darker color because you can't see it. Anyways, you see about a $250,000 increase in there. This is to reflect two cost drivers, which is one, likely retirement of a department head, not Mike, but the deputy director. And we have a 6-month overlap in there for another assistant director of facilities, which will be a different position than what it is now. The cost is up there because we are going to go out to hire a licensed engineer, which is what we don't have now. But I think as everybody in this room and everybody in Franklin knows, we still don't know how Mike does it. The expense item is an estimate based off what we're seeing for cost, supply chain problems. Plumbing, mechanicals, all supplies basically are costing a lot more money. And so that's why those increases are there. The next line item down would be the police. I didn't put in yellow, but it is about a $134,000 request. This, by the way, does not include the additional police officers that the chief behind me would be gladly to come up and advocate for. But it does include the additional officer through the cannabis program that we had earlier. So it does reflect that, and it does reflect also a myriad of costs reflective to the incredible amount of staffing transition that we've had at the police department. Not just the deputy chief, but we also anticipate 2 other senior members of the police department to be retired over the summer. And so some of the expense costs and personnel costs go into making sure that we have the proper training and transitionary costs in there. So that's the major cost driver there. The next one down is regional dispatch at 225. You'll notice a $782,000 increase. That's really there to illustrate something that is very important, which is the regional dispatch center is a regional agreement among 6 towns. We regionalized 2 regional dispatch centers 2 years ago, and as luck would have it, through incredible strategy from the board of directors, we were able to get a 5-year grant. And the 5-year grant from the state 911 office paid our full assessment, okay, for 2 of those years. They also paid for 75% of that assessment for 2 years, and this year is the 50% payment. So in other words, in FY25, the party's over, and the board of directors is either going to have to strategize on regionalizing more regional districts, or we're going to have to pay our full freight. The good news is we have money in a savings account and a stabilization account to prepare for those days, but this line item right here, I cannot emphasize enough, has really been helping us the last couple years. This is a huge, huge advantage for the town, and in FY25, we're gonna see what that brings. If we go back down one more to the 300s, to the schools, Tri-County and Norfolk Aggie, those are assessments that come to us through the state. You just plug in the number. For the Franklin Public School District and 300, you'll notice in FY22, the $67.8 million. And we ballparked in there, again, for modeling purposes, a 5% increase, which traditionally, approximately, not exactly, but around 4.5 to 5 has traditionally been the request, at about 3.4 million increase. Obviously, that is not sustainable. When a 5% increase in the school budget at 3.4 million exceeds the amount that you bring in under the tax levy, it doesn't take a lot to obviously see right out of the gate that that's not going to work. And so that right here, for modeling purposes, we've put in at a 5%, just to show the public generally, you know, in my time here, that has oftentimes been generally around the request, pandemic years aside. And so I wanted to model that out appropriately. I understand that the school department is going through their budget process now. We'll have a hearing in a couple weeks. And I know the budget book tells a different number. We'll get to that later, but just for the model. 422 DPW, a major expense increase request. For all of you on the council and the finance committee, I think you're pretty fluent in what a lot of the cost drivers are, which are 1, stormwater, which is a preview, will be on the agenda next week. And number 2, as we've talked about, it's really the department that touches virtually every square inch of Franklin. And as we saw last night again on the FinCom, you know, the demand on the DPW is quite significant. This budget model also does reflect the 2 additional positions that were cut out of last year's budget to be reinstated to try to help with the grounds division, the trail maintenance, and some of the other stuff that last summer I know all of you got complaints and I got complaints, so that's also in the model. The next one down below is the Council on Aging, is a relatively rare substantial increase. If you go back to FY21, you'll notice their budget was a whopping $266,000 for the entire senior center. The pandemic has certainly impacted that department quite a bit in that building, and we were very, very lucky to find not only one great director, but an assistant director, and we are, for those watching at home or who come and eat at the cafe, We have an offer out to a candidate, and we are hoping that that candidate is going to accept that offer, because I know I speak for myself, and I'm not a senior yet, but we are all hungry, and I am really keeping my fingers crossed, because she is an excellent, excellent candidate, and we're really excited to have her. So that increase in my budget proposal will be probably quite solid at 126. I don't see that moving very much in the final proposal. And then skipping ahead to the next page, all the way down to debt and retirement, 710. So you notice here something I've been talking about for many, many years, and I'm going to keep on talking about it for many, many years. You'll notice a lot of parentheses. That, to me, is not a good sign. The more debt service that goes away makes it much more difficult to put back in. We have a few major projects coming up. Number one, I know in the fall, we will be looking at installing a police station study committee. My guess is, but I don't know, my guess is any building of that magnitude is probably going to require a debt exclusion vote. I know, Mr. Chairman, you're very familiar with those. But from the
Near and dear to my heart.
near and dear to your heart. I know you got one more in you. And so you might as well close it out. You've done every other building. So, but in all seriousness, in that number, one issue that does affect the schools quite a bit is Remington Jefferson. We got an authorization in looking forward a couple years ago. It's time to build a new roof, the boilers, the mechanicals, the playground. I know I'm forgetting a couple projects. Don't hold it against me. But that's going to be a substantial borrowing that will go on. The fire alarms, a few other things, but that's going to be a big number. We anticipated, I believe, a $3 to $4 million number, but obviously, given what's going on in the economy, we're going to have to reevaluate that. But I anticipate once we get done with some other projects around here, I'm guessing that within FY23 or FY24, we'll be having to design out whatever is appropriate for Remington Jefferson. If we go out and borrow for that money, there's where it goes. There's where the debt cost goes, there's where the debt payments go, and there's where the interest goes. I've heard from a lot of other folks about a lot of other building and borrowing that wants to happen in terms of housing or arts centers and a variety of other stuff. Well, if we have to go out and borrow money, here's where it goes. So I just wanted to point that out. We have a town policy of 3.5% of the operating budget should be debt. That is critical to maintaining the quality of the buildings. As the school facilities analysis showed, we have exceptionally well-maintained buildings and facilities, fields, and et cetera, as well as our municipal buildings. And I think actually our facilities are don't just affect the people that use them, but they're also an attraction for recruitment. Many of the new hires that I meet for some of our buildings always come in and tell me about the equipment, the buildings, the tour of the fire station, whatever it might be. There's a lot of town hall employees that when they walk into this building and they come from a drafty old town hall in another town, this is a modern facility that really works well. So there's other benefits to keeping up with buildings in addition to saving money in the long run. And then I believe finally, line item number 910, benefits, the other albatross around our neck. You'll see pensions, retirement and pension assessment, $500,000. That's cheap this year. Last year was over $700,000. But ultimately, that's just a number you get. You either pay it or you don't. There's no choice. That's right, there's no choice. You can't not pay it. You got to pay it. Health insurance, if you want to even have a chance of recruiting any employees, you got to have a good health insurance plan. That bumped up. That's assumption right now is 5%. Yep, I agree with you, Mr. Chair. 5%, and I know Miriam and I are holding our breath too. That's a 5% number. That may not be there.
Absolutely.
Could be 7. I know the schools, I believe, have budgeted for a little higher, but nonetheless, that's me. That's me praying that I'm going to be able to do whatever it takes to get that number down. And then you look at a couple of the other line items in the budget. We haven't calculated the full numbers. Karen's going to complete those in the next week based on the enrollment that we have. But I just wanted to highlight in the benefits budget, if you look at that number, it's pretty substantial overall. I do want to highlight one other item down there, not just OPEB, but comp reserve. People will notice a huge amount there. It's a collective bargaining year. So because collective bargaining has not been solved, we just kind of set aside an estimated amount of what we think something might take to get it done. Expect that number to fluctuate probably quite a bit over the next month until a final budget is put out. I will also say that today, Karen and I had our first meeting with our consultant on the compensation and classification study, and we expect that study to be completed around Labor Day or in the fall, but that doesn't necessarily reflect anything in this budget yet. This is just kind of a placeholder for collective bargaining as we go through that process. So that is the budget mostly in a nutshell, and eventually when you get to the end, Alicia, you'll see the budget deficit again in the red somewhere. Nope, up just a little bit. Right there, 3.264 million. So that reflects the wish list so far, and I would also say it doesn't necessarily reflect the full wish list, because I know if you asked, for example, the chiefs or the DPW director or others, they would advocate for more staffing, and I respect that fully. However, the deficit really in here, I think, mostly is due to, as we've talked about before, what are the needs and the community needs of both the school department and the Department of Public Works. Stormwater obviously is on our docket this week. We'll deal with that on Wednesday, Mr. Chairman, and through the committee. But I hope people come away with a couple things. One, this is a fixed costs budget. This is not glorification. We're meat and potatoes, brick and mortar. The overwhelming percentage of our budget is personnel costs. And so when we talk about moving money around, we're really talking about jobs. When we get to Mike D'Angelo's budget, for example, in facilities, and you really look through, and you can look through old ones, we itemize out exactly how much we're going to have to pay for water at each of the school buildings, exactly how much gas we're going to have to pay. Every single facility is line item by line item broke out, and we go through it every year, and unfortunately, due to the costs of gas and some of the other things, that's going to put some additional pressure on the budget for FY23 for sure. But ultimately, that's the town budget in a nutshell.
25.
30 minutes, 20, 25?
Not bad, Jamie. Not
I
bad.
I can't zip through it any faster than that, so.
And again, as everybody is aware, this is just an initial draft of the budget, trying to get everybody to understand where we think we are right now, but tomorrow it's going to be something different, for sure. Dr. Hearn, would you like a turn? Or why don't, let me see if there's any questions.
Not yet.
She's gonna say no.
She, rather than hold questions, all questions till the end, we'll do questions for Jamie on the expense side now. Colby,
Yeah, for you. Compensation reserve, sorry, I just didn't understand really what that money
I was
set
gonna
aside
ask.
for.
So instead of saying, we can't, there's no deal for collective bargaining, so the COLA would normally be reflected in the personnel line items throughout all the budget. So the administration, the finance office, everybody, when you're in a collective bargaining year, and I'm literally taking past practice, but this is practice in every town. You set aside an amount of money to be able to put towards a COLA, the cost of living
Cover.
adjustment, otherwise known as raises. So you
Basically.
instead of estimating each budget, you just put a lump sum, and then the money gets transferred out of the account if an agreement is made.
Okay, how do we get to this number?
We just estimate on a couple percent and try to gauge based on stipends and other stuff that's in the collective bargaining agreements. We try to estimate. We have not on our end set up, well, the first round of collective bargaining meetings just got set up last night. And so those will go out in March and April, and we'll start collective bargaining. And it's I don't know what else to say about it.
Yeah. Because it's all part of negotiations, so.
It's like, it's actually literally in the words, reserve of compensation. Compensate, it's just a reserve for compensation.
Anything else, Tom?
No, that's it for now.
Natalie?
Just to clarify on that, which employees are in the CBA? Is it is it all the town employees, every single town employee is in the CBA?
This number reflects municipal unions,
Okay.
non-teacher unions. So
Non-teacher.
you've got police, sergeants, DPW, trades, custodians, fire, police, because I just go around and librarian. Thank you, Karen. Librarians. So there's like 8.
Gotcha, okay, that's perfect. And
Seven or
then,
eight.
not to look
Oh,
ahead
yeah,
to-
it does include
And-
non-union as well,
It
but
does include non-union.
right, so that's
Okay.
all municipal staff.
Okay, got it. And then, not to look ahead to doom and gloom, but I'm just curious, so regional dispatch, that's the MAC, right? What's the full cost if we were to burden that?
It's actually in here.
It is.
Well, right now, it's the 1.218.
That's the full cost, but isn't
that-
that's not discounted at the 50%?
That is not. So that number in my final budget
Will
be
go
cut in
down by
half.
50, okay.
We applied for the development grant last month, and, I don't sleep at night, and I close my, I cross my fingers, and I say, I hope I get like some indication from the state. I feel very confident in it. They've been very supportive of the merger. It helps the state. It helps everybody. It's about as strong of a grant as we could probably ever put forward. So I very
Got it,
much
okay.
anticipate that that's going to happen.
Perfect. Okay, that was it on my end.
So that's going to go down by half.
Great.
Thank you, Natalie. Anyone else? Jamie, I have one for you to follow up on Natalie's. Going forward, what are we looking at with that regional dispatch?
So it's a great question. I think you're looking at probably increases of just one point, there has not been a collective bargaining agreement with the dispatcher union over there since it's opened. There have been a couple of, it's natural for there to be a 2 or 3 year, there has been a collective bargaining agreement, but they've been 1-year agreements as they formalize as a union. They had to go through a process to certify as a union. That took a while. And so I expect that number probably to go up 2.5% to 3%, probably in perpetuity, but there's obviously nothing final. I think you're looking, by the time FY25 comes, you're probably looking at 1.5 million is my guess. And then
It's kind of where I
kick it a
was
few percent
heading it.
each year after that.
And just for the public listening, the towns that are involved,
Norfolk, Rentham, Plainville, and Franklin were the first 4. And now Mendon and Millville was its own regional dispatch. And then they really didn't have call volume, and we also built the dispatch center to take on more towns. If we didn't take on Mendon and Millville right now, that number right now would be well over 1.5 to 1.7 million. So ultimately, it saved money in 2 different ways, one from the grant, but also one from the economies of scale you get from a broader merger.
and do we have more room for growth?
We do have more room for more growth at the MEC. Yep.
Any other questions for Jamie?
Sorry, I have another one.
Go for it, Natalie.
Okay, so we're at 3.2 short. Assuming, fingers crossed, MEC comes in, we're at 600 plus, so you get to like 2.6 short. What's the ask? Do you go back to departments and say, okay? A
Okay.
general, like just a general, like, I'm just curious, do you go back to departments, give them a general decrease? Do you target certain people? What is, and I get we have 2 million for rainy day, but obviously we don't want you to use that. So do you consider, like, at what point do you, like, how much do you push back on departments to have to decrease? How much do you start to consider rainy day? What are the steps there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think looking out into the future, the chair's question, when you're looking out to FY25, I think that's where you're, as a community, that's going to be a tough year. unforeseen circumstances aside that we can't predict. I have to closet because we just had one of those unforeseen circumstances for 2 years, right? But yeah, it's going back to the departments. I mean, I know the school department is revised its budget, and I know that they'll probably talk about, the FY23 budget. That number will obviously be lower. And then you're looking at the DPW as a major cost increase. And I highlighted those ones in yellow because those are your big cost drivers. And so we're gonna go back to those departments and say, well, if we have to decline the increase in the facilities department of 100,000 for parts, what's the consequence, right? And I think at this point, it's pretty tough for me to see. It's everybody here's decisions, not unilaterally mine. Just to make sure it's clear, if the community wants to go into the budget stabilization fund, that's certainly the community's choice. But I was here. You were 3 or 4 years ago when we zeroed it out over 2 years. And we used to have 2 million. And it's going to be a values level, decision about do we go backward on that policy objective, or do we try to get to the AAA status and some other objectives? And is it truly a rainy day? I don't know. I'm not so sure it's a monsoon yet, but we'll have to see, obviously wait and see how the state legislature performs too.
Thank
I'm all
you.
set this time.
One more, Jamie.
Sure.
Just since we're talking about projecting out a little. Pension contributions. They are, we know what we're projecting this year, but take me out 2 or 3 years. What's the what's the future hold? I mean, we got a little bit of that when we had the OPEB
Yeah.
consultant in.
It's just I think to your point, I think the pension assessment from Norfolk County and health insurance, just a couple examples. These are expensive fixed costs. So when we see a big revenue tax levy, I think, sometimes I look at it too and I go, wow, that's a lot more money than we thought. But you're already eating a third out of that number easy with just benefits. And just to illustrate your question, in 2010, the Norfolk County pension assessment for Franklin was $3.4 million. It's now 7 in 11 years. So I think if you're looking out the next decade, again, barring any major market problems, which could happen, I think you're looking at the same trend. Without some significant level of pension reform, which, by the way, the legislature has done on a couple of occasions over the last 10 years to deal with this. It's just an expensive item because we live in an expensive state with expensive insurance that's the best in the world.
I kind of knew the answer, but
I had a feeling
really
you
didn't
did.
want to ask the question,
You
but
wanna-
I figured I'd ask it anyway.
It's better to ask questions than answer them, right?
Make everybody cry.
Kobe, I can see that quizzical look.
I
I'm just trying to clarify, what is this, we just sit and let it eat away more and more of our budget until the state changes because every town is going through the same thing?
This has been a problem, for decades. This is not something new. The teachers, and I think the educators are in the MTRS system, which is different. I think it's the same dynamic on their side. They can speak better to it, but maybe it's not. I don't know. But, ultimately, yeah, until there's a reform. And I think the hard part for municipal government is, and state government as well, remember, they have their own pension problem. They have their own OPEB problem, too, the Commonwealth. Call up Ways and Means, and you probably got a $7 billion OPEB liability at the state level, too. So it's just one of those things that I think the moral contract, if you will, maybe lack of a better term, it's probably not the right one, but between public employees and is traditionally been lower wages, modest increases in salaries, no bonuses if the company does great. It's the slow and steady tortoise in the race, but the benefit is that there's a sustainable pension at the end of a long career. You're a part of that now, and honestly, seriously, you pay into it. You do.
But it
And-
seems like we're not gonna be able to afford it. I'm not gonna.
Well, the good news is the pension fund is fairly well funded at this point. You heard Dan Sherman's presentation on OPEB last week. It's just simply one of those fixed costs that just comes with the cost of doing business. It's like putting on lights, putting on the gas, putting on the heat. It's just part of the system. Same thing with health insurance. We have an insurance advisory committee made up of membership of the non-union as well as every single union in town, including the teachers. And Miriam and I spend, used to spend a lot more time, but we don't have it anymore, going through tons of calculations and metric about plan design. We meet monthly with all the employees to get their feedback. We understand the tagline, which will never change, of my health insurance went up 5%, but my pay went up 2%. That's it. That's the way it is. I don't foresee any changing to that dynamic at any point, probably in the rest of my career, because it's just the numbers. You got a pie of however much money you got to divvy it up, and we do. I really I'm not tooting my own, but with Miriam and Lisa and Karen and all of the IAC members, all of the unions, they spend a lot of time coming in and learning about this stuff. They've been over the last 10 years. Ultimately, we've done really well, and we've bended most of the trends in health insurance because it's a lot of hard work that goes on at the staff level to do that. And we should have our health insurance rates in the next few weeks. But these are just fixed costs of doing business, in my view. Yeah. And
We're gonna hire someone new to do it better. That's also part of this.
yeah, I mean, I can't speak for Miriam, but I'd like to think I can. I mean, we're just getting squeezed out time-wise of negotiating to the level of analysis and analytics that we used to do. And we've been very lucky in the last few years where we've offered a health savings account plan, and a lot of employees have been really, really happy with it, and our numbers have gone up, which has saved money a lot and given a great benefit to the employees. And I am beyond grateful for that, because just from a sanity and time management perspective, having that consistency with Harvard Pilgrim for a few years has actually saved us probably more time than we probably think. And so, yeah, we just keep rolling ahead.
Do you expect this new person to be able to pay for themselves, essentially, in terms of savings?
That's a great question. I hadn't thought of it like that. I'd like to think so. That there might be some creative ways and techniques that the individual could work with our consultant and us and the unions on that. I haven't done the numbers or crunched the numbers, but it certainly would offset it, I think, to some level for sure. And staff education, it's a great point. And we had Karen and everybody put together a benefits fair. It was really popular, but then the pandemic hit, and that staff education piece, was huge. Each unit, including the teachers, have had some really great advocates go word of mouth to other employees, and especially newer people that come in, really should be taking advantage of the HSA program.
All set? Anyone else? Dr. Ahern,
Hi,
your
good
turn.
evening. Thank you.
I'll see you in a little bit.
So thank you. I appreciate having an opportunity to share a little bit about the FY23 school department budget, and maybe a little bit too in that line of education related to how our revenues come together between the state and the local contribution. I appreciate Jamie putting the model in for the school department kind of while we engage in our iterative budget development process this spring. The model that he put in is typically what a level service increase would be. So based on some typical assumptions that we would make related to collective bargaining agreements, a 5% tuition rate increase for out-of-district tuitions, some transportation cost increases that we expect annually, and health insurance, we do typically see something on the order of I wouldn't say $3 million, but low threes to $3.5 million increase from level service year over year. Where we are in budget development at this point is that the superintendent's recommended budget was presented to the school committee on Tuesday of this week, so just a couple of days ago. And so, from Jamie's model, we're kind of honing in on what the ultimate school department budget will be with the school committee, who it is anticipated will approve it on April 12th after the budget hearing, which is being held on March 22nd. The budget that I'm recommending falls below the kind of 5% increase that Jamie was talking about at 3.5%, or an increase of $2.4 million. One of the things that we've been experiencing over the past couple of years with COVID, going back to the spring of 2020 and then last year in 2021, is that some of our expenses have been less than we have typically experienced. And so some of our revolving accounts have amassed a balance that allow us to have an increased amount of revolving account offsets going into next year's budget, which helps us bring that down to the 3.5%. So what's on the table right now, proposed for the school committee's consideration, is a budget of $70,216,996, or a roughly $2.4 million increase. And at this point in time, we're proposing and feel comfortable with offsetting the budget. That would be the allocation request, and we would be offsetting $75 million roughly in expenses with about $5.6 million in revolving accounts. So that's how we're kind of bringing that down for this year. It's still a process. The budget subcommittee will be meeting next week. Again, the budget hearing is on the 22nd, and the school committee will kind of iterate this budget over the next couple of weeks to months before we present it to FinCom and, of course, to the town council. In terms of kind of where our revenues are coming from, just to sort of communicate with you as well as the community at home, Jamie talked a bit about kind of the revenues and some of the trends being seen from the town in kind of that holistic way. As far as kind of the school department goes, Chapter 70 is our big revenue coming in from the state, and then the local contribution contributes to the overall budget of the town. The Student Opportunity Act was passed a couple of years ago and was a major reform effort around Chapter 70 to take a look at how the state was funding education. And there are communities that are receiving significantly more in Chapter 70 funds. And what the Student Opportunities Act really took a look at was that there wasn't an adequate amount of funding going towards educating students who may have low income status, educating English learners, the increased costs of special education, as well as healthcare costs. There are many communities, and Franklin is one, that has declining enrollment, and so we are not seeing as much revenue coming in, or an increase in revenue coming in from Chapter 70 as some other communities that are kind of expanding in population, because our enrollment is down, and our enrollment is down based on not choice or people fleeing the district, but really our enrollment is down based on lower birth rates. We're graduating 450 high schoolers, and we're bringing in about 300 kindergartners, and that's been happening now for many years, 8 years, 9 years, something like that. And so our enrollment goes down. We don't lose Chapter 70 money. They do an increase every year of $30 per pupil on the Chapter 70 amounts that they had given last year, which is why you see the increase of about $155,000 in Jamie's packet materials. But that's actually only increasing 0.5% next year. Meanwhile, the state is expecting the foundation budget, which is kind of the floor of what you would spend on education, to go up 4.5%, recognizing that it costs more to educate students today than it did when the formula was originally put in place. And as such, they're expecting more from the local contribution to make up that, what's called the required district contribution to make up the difference. And that's been happening over the past decade or so, many, many years. And the required district contribution is increasing at a rate of about 5.5% next year. Historically, the average is that it's going up about 3%. So the state is expecting Franklin as a town to contribute more towards that budget. As a result, there's extra state aid with the enrollment decrease and the Chapter 70 not going down. So we spent a lot of time talking about that on Tuesday evening, and I just think it's important to note when we think about, the state needs to give us more money, the state needs to give us more money according to their formula, which is based on the median income in town and property values. They would say differently and are saying differently in terms of how the numbers are playing out. And so I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but that's kind of how the formula is working for Franklin. I think that kind of covers at the highest level where we are with the school department budget and some of the historical pieces. I think, we're still kind of ultimately in this process of putting the budget together. There are some variables that are still kind of outstanding, and as Jamie said, this is an ongoing iterative process, not only during the development process, but also as it kind of gets implemented and plays out. And I guess I just want to say too, I really appreciate the collaboration with the town administrator's office in putting the budget together and the communication throughout the year. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hunt. Questions for Dr. Melanie, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through the chair, just Dr. Ahern, thank you for the update. And I just have a question about the revolving funds, since we don't hear about them that much on the council side. I was wondering will those be empty now?
Yeah.
Like, where does the money come from to fill it up?
Sure.
Is it like just a little more detail?
Perfect.
That's all.
Yep, no
Thank you.
problem. And Miriam is kind of the expert, I think, in revolving accounts.
Good.
But
So
I
we
will
get-
share a bit about them.
So
the-
we'll get Marion to speak a little bit.
Revolving area.
we have a number of revolving accounts, which is an area where things like fees may come in that we assess for various reasons. So we have, for example, a preschool tuition revolving account from the preschool tuition that families pay for pre-K. We have a transportation revolving account. We have athletic revolving account, we have a school choice revolving account, we have a used textbooks revolving account. There's a lot of different accounts that we have, and fees go into those revolving accounts, and expenses can be paid out of the revolving accounts. They have to be paid kind of directly. You can't use the transportation to offset something else in the budget, but the transportation account can offset what we ultimately pay in transportation. So it helps to kind of subsidize that overall bill. There were fees collected in 1920, for example, like athletic fees. We also collected transportation fees. The pandemic happened, and certain revolving accounts
Right, okay.
accumulated funds over time. And we've been, kind of building a balance back up because our expenses had been lower than we had expected due to just the shutdown. And so we're able to apply these additional revolving funds according to those appropriate lines. Next year, we did something similar last year. And this is something that occurred prior to my arrival in Franklin. So there was a point in time where the revolving accounts had, again, amassed a balance and were strategically spent down. And that, I think, was right around when I joined Franklin. They were where we want them to be, which is not depleted, so we don't zero them out. But basically, we we aim to keep a year in the bank, and so so this year we're collecting the money and we'll use it next year. So there's always kind of a year in the bank. And I think we take in about $4 million a year.
Yeah, 4 to 4.5.
4 to 4.5 in any given year, so that's what we would usually aim to spend, but
Okay.
because our balances are a little higher, we are proposing 5.5 million at this time.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
Anything else?
It was a great explanation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mel. Anyone? Mr. McNeil?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I'd like to say thank you, Dr. Hearn, thank you, Miriam, so much for all the hard work you've been doing, putting together the proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year on the school side. And yeah, I'd just like to highlight, I think, we see this number right here with 71.2 million, with your proposed budget being roughly 1 million less than that, this is low funding, your dedication to having a efficient and fiscally responsible budget on the school side and doing what we can with revolving accounts, as well as other enrollment decreases that we touched upon on Tuesday. And while we were on the topic earlier on the town side of funds that are going to be sunsetting in the next few years, could you please touch upon the ESSER funding and the funds that are going to be used in this fiscal year and the upcoming fiscal year, and what those funds, what the implication for those are long-term?
Sure, that's a really important point and an important question. So we have received a number of, like the town has as well, a number of coronavirus relief fund sources. And ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3 are kind of the ones that were maybe the biggest allocations. And we have spent our ESSER 1 funds and our ESSER 2 funds on areas earlier in the pandemic. We've been really trying to be strategic around our application around the ESSER funds. They do sunset. ESSER 3 will sunset at the end of FY '24. So we have 2 more years. But we recognize that kind of recovering from the pandemic and supporting students isn't kind of a one-year deal. And so we have built a plan based on input from the community, input from families, input from faculty and staff to support some counselors, the diversity, equity, and inclusion director, some after-school tutoring for middle school and high school students, elementary interventionists to address any learning loss or learning gaps, particularly in ELA and math. And we've kind of built a plan for those to be applied in the next 2 years. So that helps to kind of augment the services that the students are receiving through the operating budget. The monies will sunset in 2 years. And so there will need to be kind of an analysis and a question around return on investment and whether or not those services are still needed kind of 2 years after, 3 years after the shutdown potentially. And if the school committee, wishes to continue those services, bring them into the operating budget going forward. And so there is a bit of, kind of 2 years out, needs to be planned for, I think, FY '23 and FY '24, given where we are with revolving funds and the ESSER funding, are going to be being okay. But as we get a few years out into FY '25, I think that would be something that needs to be planned for. Our enrollment is decreasing, so there may be some things that can shift around in the operating budget. We did find a way to fold in some of the initiatives that were funded through ESSER 1, like our digital learning integrationists, counselor. Those are now being paid out of the operating budget, and those are the types of plans that will need to be made looking out towards FY '25.
Thank you.
All set, Dave. Any other questions for Ryan? Go for it.
Oh, all right, I guess I'll be last. Through you, Mr. Chairman. Hi, ladies. Thanks for coming. When I used to watch these meetings at home before I was involved in all this stuff, I would think of some of these questions just so maybe people at home can understand. So right now, we have 5.6 million in revolving funds. And not just that money, but there's also, you want 3.4 million more? Is that correct? The 3.391, not to be exact, that's what you're asking for?
So, the increase that we're, proposing in the budget is 2.4 million.
I have the two, okay, I just saw on, the 300.
That's Jamie's.
That was
Jamie's
his
model.
model,
This is
Your
my-
model is just 2.4.
2.4.
Oh, so you're a lot less, okay, thank you. That helps. Yeah, no, I'm just, and I brought up the stabilization funds and all this, just because we're just starting out, and I already have been hearing the O word, the override word, and I just would like to look at every single thing before we have to even ever think about raising someone's taxes. So, and I see that you are hiring quite a few people. And I know I know there was the will of the school committee to hire a lot of the extra counselors and all that stuff. And you just kind of said that once all this is gone in FY '25, we could be looking at all those people being laid off.
So I wouldn't, can I
Sure,
respond to
please,
that?
go ahead.
I can understand that there may be, including with some of the history, some trepidation around, potential layoffs in the future. We are and have been, I think, pretty conscientious about keeping up with enrollment-driven reductions in terms of maintaining classroom size within the school committee guidelines, particularly, well, across the entire district, but particularly in areas where the enrollment has been decreasing, which is elementary and middle. That's going to be making its way into the high school. And so we have been looking, well, I can appreciate kind of the optics and the perspective that you're adding positions. These are positions going to support a growing and more diverse set of needs among students. They're very specifically geared towards some special education services and English language learning teachers, because those are the needs that are emerging and are being unmet. They're also mandated and required for us to meet per IEP contracts and state law. But we are, I think, being conscientious and making some adjustments and changes, and keeping up with enrollment-driven reductions in the budget, because we don't want to end up in a situation where, there's major loss of staff and major cuts to services on the part of students. So I do appreciate that worry, and so we're.
I do, I worry, because I hate when young people just starting out get hired, and they're here for 365 days, and all of a sudden, we go off the cliff, as we talk about,
Right.
And, I mean, it's not 2008 luckily, but,
Right.
things like that, it's not
Yep.
that far away
Yep.
before that we remember all that
Yep.
stuff, Thank you very much.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Brian.
One quick number.
Certainly, go ahead.
I'm sure I could do the math out, but if you have it, so the amount more that you're proposing that we spend on, the percent more that you're proposing we spend on schools this year with the revolving fund and the town, so it's 3.5 from the town, I think is what you said,
3.5%, 2.4 million from the town, yep.
with the revolving, what's the
With the revolving, it's 4%,
4 flat? Sweet, thank you.
3.99,
To be exact.
or 2.9 million.
Well said, Kobe.
Yeah.
I just have a couple of things, or questions on the school part of the budget. And I'll clarify that. One of my biggest pet peeves is going back to my days on the school committee in the 90s, was school side, town side. I don't like the word side because it puts opposing. So I prefer to use part because it's part of the whole. So that's why I use part rather than the other word. So anyway, could you discuss a little bit the dynamic with net school spending this year and then project it out?
Sure, sure. So let me just get,
'Cause that's a number that we always hear.
yeah. So, net school spending, is, there's required net school spending and then actual net school spending. And required net school spending is a function of the Chapter 70 aid that you receive and the required local contribution. Then there's actual net school spending, which takes into account the actual amount that is spent on schools. And the vast majority of districts spend above the required net school spending. So like per pupil expenditure, it's another measure and another way you can compare district to district in terms of expenses. So, and per pupil expenditure can be a little misleading at times. You don't necessarily know how the district is set up, and they may have smaller schools or if they have larger schools. So it's just another way to compare. And so for actual net school spending, Franklin does spend more than the requirement, more than the required net school spending. And the number that we had used in the presentation on Tuesday was by 11%. And that was an FY20 number. The Department of Education, since we put the presentation together, has since done FY21. But in FY20, the number over the requirement was 11%. Just out of comparison, most districts, the majority of districts are more than 25% above required net school spending. So it's just another kind of comparison from community to community. It's something that we keep tabs on. If you don't meet the requirement, there are some penalties that the Department of Education imposes. And I think it's also related to the comment that I made previously about the required contribution expected to go up on an annual basis. And I want to say at this point in time, the expectation on the part of the Department of Education is that the town of Franklin is contributing 71% of the requirement. But in actuality, it's lower than that because of the excess base aid that that the state is providing on the order of $11 million. That requirement, that expectation is increasing by about 3% per year, and will ultimately reach the maximum, which is 82.5% of the required net school spending.
Thank you.
We'll have some graphics in
I knew you,
during
as we
presentation,
progress,
and
I
you'll
totally
have much more
understand.
detail when we come to the Finance Committee, when we come to Town Council. There'll be more detail and some graphics for you around net school spending, foundation aid, all of that.
I have one more.
They are on the website, you're right.
I have one more. As you'll be finishing your 5th year here and moving on in June, what do you see as the critical financial issues facing Franklin as we move forward the next 5 years?
Yeah, thank you, and I'm so sorry to be moving on after these 5 years. I
And
feel like it
we're
was.
sorry to see you move on.
I feel like it was just yesterday that I was interviewing in this room, and Tom, you were sitting up there with the school committee.
I was sitting there, yes, I was.
So I think, like I said, I think we're at a point probably pretty similar to where the schools and the town were just prior to my arrival, where the revolving accounts were higher and being spent down in order to kind of compensate and help to offset the budget. My worry would be in a couple of years, ESSER funding's expiring, the revolving accounts come back to that 1 year in, 1 year out kind of policy level, and the structural budget deficit hasn't been addressed, and the expectation of the Department of Education continues to increase in terms of what that required local contribution would be. And at some point, your net school spending would come down to that requirement. You could potentially fall below the required net school spending, if you don't kind of keep tabs and watch for that. So I just, there's a graph that we have in the budget hearing presentation around the the state versus the local contribution, and
Yeah.
I think you have to keep tabs on watching what the state's expectation of the local contribution. That's going up 5.6% next year. Meanwhile, and I get it, that it's a hard thing to hear, your enrollment's going down by 2%, the state's going up 0.5%. You know, there's a message there that they're conveying, and I say that very respectfully, also knowing that there's lots of folks in town who aren't feeling that their income or their median income is going up, or property values. So I share that respectfully.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? George?
One quick question. I think we're relatively unique where facilities costs, for instance, are on the town side budget. And, you know, we talked about cutting the grass at the high school and that kind of stuff. Does that get, where in other communities, it's in the school budget? Is that number adjusted so that, you know, we're not, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
For
it
your- for
is.
your net.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. It does get adjusted. So while it's budgeted, facilities are budgeted on, you know, kind of the municipal part, and the technology, for example, is budgeted in the school part. There's a reconciliation for auditing purposes where there's a MOU, and Jamie and I both sign it, that kind of show how the money gets split for facilities. And so then that kind of gets reported appropriately where it needs to go for us for the Department of Ed.
What about the cost of buildings? Because I had that issue with the amount we have to spend on the library, for instance. They don't factor in the fact that we just spent, if memory serves, like $11+ million on the building itself. Does that kind of, is
No.
that considered school spending?
No.
I don't believe so.
No, capital, Miriam's,
So capital doesn't count towards net school spending. It is reported, and so whenever the town spends money on buildings and on capital projects for the schools, it gets reported, but those expenses don't count towards net school spending. But for example.
As long as it's removed from everybody else. You know what I mean? We're either adding it in or.
Yeah, that's across the board. It's across the board. So I wouldn't expect other districts to be reporting capital and have that apply towards net school spending, because it doesn't. But when an expense like Chromebooks, for example, is paid for from a capital expense, that does get included in net school spending, because Chromebooks are a direct educational expense, direct to students in a classroom, and the way we have to report it, that is allocated and counts towards that school spending. So all of those expenses, as Dr. Hearn mentioned, are identified based on an agreement that we have between the town and the schools. And generally, that number is in excess of $15 million on a yearly basis.
Thank you.
I'll say George. Dave?
Thank you. To follow up on something you said, Dr. Hearn, you mentioned that if a community falls below required net school spending, there are penalties. And you also said, the way things are going, that is a real possibility. So what would those penalties entail?
I think they can withhold funding. It's kind of like a
Chapter
double
70
whammy.
That's-
money goes this way.
It would be right, Chapter 70? Yeah.
Yeah.
that's what I thought.
Do we know to what degree funding would be withheld?
There's a certain percentage, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I could get it back to you.
You have to spend a minimum of 95% of net school spending. Yeah. You have to spend at least 95% of your required net school spending. If you fall below 95%, that's when the state can penalize you and reduce your Chapter 70 funding.
Okay, which would be even less money than we would have for schools. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Any other questions or comments? Jamie, any closing comments?
I would just say that I'll give the opportunity at the council meeting under TA report. We're going to include the packet from tonight at next week's meeting in case there's any other questions from any other folks. And then after that, the staff and I are going into a cave and we're writing all the budget documents. Don't expect to hear from us for what now. In all seriousness, it is a lot of work on our staff to put it all together. I was looking at Miriam's book. Like, oh my God. And I expect the budget to be put out April 18th, 19th, or 20th. I just, some of the numbers obviously in here are going to change. We have our system internally, and at each of the council meetings from here on out, I'll try to give a budget update in where we're at, and I'm sure the superintendent will at the school committee as well, and we'll just try to keep the information coming out.
Thank you, Jamie.
One last comment, a shameless plug. The Finance Committee meets,
May 9th through the 12th, 4 nights.
4 nights. That's the only place that every single line of the budget is talked about.
Right.
Every single line. And the chiefs are here, the superintendent is there. It's just the only place that it happens. The council goes at a very high level, school committee goes at a high level, we go at a detail level. And people ought to be aware of that and pay attention to that. And we're pretty good at asking questions. Some of them are stupid, I'll admit, I'm in that line.
Never a stupid question.
Through Mr. Chair, to George's point, I'm glad he brought up the shameless plug. Not only is it true about the line item by line item, but it's a 4-night week for us. We may trim it down 1 night, but I think the 4 nights have worked really well so that if you're a member of the public, general government is 1 night, public safety is another night, the schools have their own night, and I am working to bring the superintendent to Tri-County down to those meetings as well. And DPW is its own night, so there's plenty of time to stretch out if people really do have questions and concerns or priorities. I mean, it really is a pretty good process, and it's worked out well for a few years.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Jamie. Thank you, George. Kobe?
I got my own shameless plug. It seems like if we want to continue to enjoy the services that we have, that we need new growth that doesn't create an increased burden on our services, and that comes through zoning. And there's a Franklin for All survey that's going on now. If you have not filled out the survey, please help us rezone.
He's going to zoom in on the card.
Yeah.
Put it up, Kobe. They're going to QR code it from
Kobe's on a
home.
roll.
They're going to put the iPhone up to the TV. There we go.
Yeah, that's it.
Yes. Fill it out.
But
Put your
Franklin
phones
for All,
up.
if you find it at the website on MAPC. That's going to be it's a huge part of fiscal solvency. Oh, wow. Very well done.
That's so cool.
Impressive. Thank you, Chris.
Okay. Mr. Sherlock, just name and address, please.
Yes, Steve Sherlock, 10 Lawrence Drive, recording for Franklin Matters. Some folks were doing some napkin math, et cetera. So just to clarify, and thank you all certainly for going through the details you did. Obviously, there's still numbers to be worked out. But I think we started with 3.2 deficit, which might be reduced by that 600K from the MEC. So we get down to 2.6. If my math is correct, the school's asking for 1.1 less than the model. So the 2.6 could come down to 1.5.
Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. You're on a roll.
There's still a lot of work to do, so to George's point and Kobe's point, there's still a lot of work to do, but it's not the 3.2. The nut is kind of down a little bit, but there's still a lot of work to do. I just wanted to check. Thank you.
Okay, again,
You have somebody on Zoom.
somebody on Zoom.
Al Charles.
Al Charles. Al, you want to unmute yourself and?
Sure. Thank you for allowing me to ask the question. Al Charles, 1035 Franklin, Mass. Jamie had mentioned around the AAA rating, and I'm glad to hear that we're close to that. We're the step below that. I guess my question is, had we been at AAA this past year, how would that have changed our finances for FY22?
Is an incredibly great question. So the last time the treasurer collector went out to borrow, we were at a 1.4 interest rate. It's pretty low. We're crossing our fingers that that's going to happen again. So the AAA bond rating, I'm not so sure would have impacted this year's budget substantially because there really wasn't a lot of borrowing. The biggest impact that might have had would be on Maple Hill, the property which we're going out to borrow for in another month. I think looking forward, Al, the AAA is critical for some of the other projects that I had just mentioned in terms of the borrowing on Remington Jefferson or whether or not there's a police station and how that happens. And I think there's probably some other projects waiting in the wings too. And so having that AAA ensures in this kind of volatile marketplace that we're putting our best feet forward. So it probably wouldn't have had much of an impact this year, Al, but certainly moving forward, it should have an equalizing effect on wherever market forces are out there. And I just have to say, to end off, it's just like one of those things that our finance team and I look at, and it's just frustrating because you pass CPA, that is a huge, huge advantage on getting a AAA. It's saying in the middle of a pandemic, taxpayers are willing to raise revenue and taxes at a ballot. That is a huge, the rainy day funds, $2 million, the general stabilization, all the metrics show, and to quote our finance director to Standard & Poor's last year, what the bleep is it going to take for us to get a AAA around here? And he's right. And I love the energy and passion behind it because it really is something that we really want to try to strive towards. And it is frustrating because we think we're there. But in the future, it'll definitely have an impact on the debt and interest in all likelihood.
That answer your question, Al?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Melanie, one last one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's sort of a comment to the committee. Last night, Councilor Frangelo and I were at the Massachusetts Municipal Association Legislative Dinner, an event, and they have some priorities that I think would be really nice if this committee, maybe we could write a letter and send it to our legislative group to support these priorities. And one of them is to raise the unrestricted fund by 7.3%, change the Chapter 70 minimum aid communities up to $100 per student instead of $30. I thought it was amazing that 43% of the communities in Massachusetts are minimum aid. So it's like there's a lot of communities out there that aren't getting enough because we know that it costs way more than the increase of $30 per student to make sure we have enough. They also are trying to get better funding for Chapter 90 because we know that yesterday's cost to make a road is obsolete. I mean, today it costs way more than, like every day it just keeps going up. So I thought it would be a nice thing, since this is this great group we have together, we're working together as a team. Hopefully we could put something together, send it to our legislative team, and cheer on these priorities.
Great, thank you, Mel. Okay, again, I think it's important for everybody to understand and I hope appreciate the time and effort that people are putting into the Joint Budget Subcommittee was something that was started about 12 years ago, something like that. It was when I first got on the town council, and Jeff Nutting was a big proponent of it, getting the Finance Committee, representation from the Finance Committee, the School Committee, and the Town Council, which are the three, as it states in our charge, relevant finance boards in the town. And if we get that group together, and what we have here is a subcommittee from the Finance Committee, the Budget Subcommittee from the School Committee, and the Budget Subcommittee from the Town Council, hearing the same message from our administration and bringing the same message back to our boards so that we're, for the most part, in unity as to the message that we're bringing to the public. And I think that's the most important piece that we can do as a subcommittee, is be unified and be presenting the same message to everyone. So, with that, I did state earlier that I'd like to get together in April. Jamie, maybe you and Dr. Hearn could get together with some dates that might work for everyone. Excuse me. We'll probably have a little more information by then. You know, the budget will have gone through the school committee. We'll have more information from the town council. So, and the finance committee will be prepping for their dig down. And I agree. And George, thank you very much for bringing that point up, because I do believe that if people are interested in the entire budget or any piece of the budget, the place to go is the finance committee, because they look at every single line item throughout. And all the department heads are there as they're going through their budgets, so you have the right people there to answer the questions. So, but that's not the only opportunity. You do, the school department has a public hearing on their part of the budget. The town council has public hearings on the entire budget. So, take some of these opportunities as citizens of Franklin to understand what we're facing, the financial struggles that we are facing now and that we will be facing in the coming years, because we know they're coming. So with that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Non-debatable. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you, one and all.